My name is Dave Elving. I'm the interim executive director here at San Francisco Camerawork. And before we get started, one of the things we've started doing here is doing a really brief land acknowledgement. We are on the ancestral land of the Ramitash Ohlone people. And so we want to acknowledge that as we get started. One of the wonderful things about Zoom, though, is that we are not just confined to the San Francisco Bay Area. We have people coming in from all over the country. We've had speakers from all over the country. And that's been really, really wonderful. It's a silver lining to having to be online as we have people from all over. So thank you for joining us tonight. Tonight, we are going to be featuring the work of Christopher Colville. I first got to encounter his work. We were talking before we let everybody into the room over a decade ago at Rayco here in San Francisco. And I remember initially being a little startled and not really being drawn to the work the first time I saw it and understood what he was doing with gunpowder. But over time and thinking about it, it really started to grow on me. And I was excited actually to acquire one of Chris's pieces at our auction last year. And you may have seen his work at our auction again this year. So, Chris, I want to thank you for being a supporter of Camerawork for a long time. And that's just a reminder to me, to communicate to you, we are a nonprofit organization. So we rely on your support and the support of artists like Chris. So if you're not a member, please check out our website at sfcamerawork.org and learn about how you can be a member and how you can find out about programs like the program we're having tonight with Chris. So Chris is joining us from his studio in the desert in Arizona, and we are so excited to have him. Chris Colville, thank you for being here.
Oh, it's my pleasure to be here. This is fun seeing all these faces pop up in here. There are people in here I haven't seen for years, and then I see my son right in the middle as well. So it's nice to have a variety of you guys showing up. So thank you for having me.
One thing that I would like to add just before we get started is that this evening's program is being recorded. So later on, if you'd like to participate in the Q&A, you are welcome to unmute and turn your camera on. Also, we'd encourage you to ask questions at any time through the program tonight. You can paste those into the chat, and I will ask them of Chris as we go along. So please do ask questions throughout the program tonight. Go ahead, Chris.
Okay. Good. Well, when questions pop up, I might not see them live. So as Dave passes them through, I'm more than happy to address anything. It might take me a minute to get back to where I was going. I can be a little disorganized, so I'll try not to do that. Let's see if I can get my screen shared here for you. Okay. Good. So does that show up? You guys see my screen okay?
Yeah, good.
Excellent. Okay. What I'd like to do tonight is talk a little bit about my approach towards photography. And to do that, I'm going to move backwards and show you a number of bodies of work rather than focusing on just one or two. With that said, I may go through things a little bit quickly. So if you're interested or have questions, please let me know. And I'm willing to revisit anything or move around. Now, for the majority of the work I do is pretty experimental in nature, and it engages in orthodox uses of the medium. I'm really excited to work in these ways, but more importantly, I'm excited about the medium of photography as a whole. Oftentimes, I move back to the transformative power of the traditional photograph, which for me is equally as engaging as anything that I can do experimentally. And that's really where my core comes from. A number of years ago, I read an interview by the artist James Welling, and he said, "I'm interested in the foundations or fundamentals or essence of photography, but those fundamentals shift with every project I work on." And this is a quote that has stuck with me over the years because that's really sort of how I feel about photography. I'm an artist that's primarily interested in ideas. And since I'm interested in ideas, I feel that it's important to refigure photography and push it to its limits for each project and every way of working. Let's see. These first images are images that I've worked on over the years with gunpowder, and they're what most people are familiar with. But I also want to go back and talk about sort of the origins of where I began making images. And that was in making images that were engaging issues of identity and sort of finding myself. The earliest photographs I made that were very important to me, I made when I was an undergraduate at Washington University. And at that point in time, I was very interested in ideas of identity, and particularly the fragility of masculinity. I had moved away from home for the very first time, and I was trying to figure out who I was and how I fit into this world. And with my roommates and the people that I lived with, I started making portraits and photographing sort of our daily life. With these two fellas, they were my roommates later in college, and we sort of realized we were playing this game with masculinity. We all tried to pretend that we were tough. We got tattoos and rode motorcycles, but in the end, it was really all for show. And because we recognized that, we were able to play with it a little bit, and we never took it too seriously. At the same time, I was trying to figure out sort of what it meant to live with more people. Let's see, I'm not moving forward. There we go. And this was the first time in my life that I ever lived with a large group of men. And I wanted to figure out what it meant or how I could show my love for these individuals. It wasn't something that was sort of normal for me or something I'd grown up with. And I was looking for different sort of outlooks for role models. And trying to find role models in the mid-90s to have how to show caring and love for the men in your life wasn't something that was really easy to come by. I looked at westernized movies and realized the only time that I saw men engaging each other in sort of an act of camaraderie and love was at a point of loss or a point of death. And photographing these TV screens was a way of sort of communicating the sense of being scared in that space. It wasn't until I moved to New Mexico and was in graduate school at the University of New Mexico that I really started working with cameraless photography and engaging in photography in more experimental terms. Part of that was happenstance. I was given the opportunity to teach an alternative process course. And when they asked me if I could teach it, I said, sure. And really, I didn't know what I was doing. However, a good friend, John Mann, gave me his notes, and I learned through the class and through that process. Early on in the course, I was teaching the process of photogenic drawings or salted paper prints. And I had bought a bunch of squid because they were really beautiful. And I thought that they were translucent enough to make images from. And while I was demonstrating this, a friend of mine passed along a story about another friend who would watch fishermen throw small squid off the boat that were too small to sell at market. And the piles of squid that would sort of sit on the beach would decompose. And as they would decompose, they'd phosphoresce and give off sort of their own light source. And to me, that was really sort of a beautiful thing to think about an object giving off light in its decomposition. At the same time, or that same week, I was reading a book by Ann Carson, and one of the opening lines in the book said, "A wound gives off its own light, surgeons say. If all the lamps in the house were turned out, you could dress this wound by what shines from it." Carson's quote for me created a beautiful sort of image of mortality, that it's for me sort of hard to imagine anything more beautiful than light emitted from a wound or a healing body, which is similar to pain that gives way to bigger experiences or decay that gives way to new life. To create each of these images, I placed the squid in light-tight boxes where they would decompose for 3 or 4 days, and their sort of clouds of emanations would be collected on the film and recorded as sort of a death mask in the space. The first images were the 8x10 negatives, and later on I ended up printing these as large 40x50-inch positives. I was stunned that when they turned into positives, they actually took on the hue of the ocean in these blue colors. And interestingly enough, we were talking about Reiko earlier. It wasn't until after I exhibited this piece at Reiko that I learned from a marine biologist who had seen the exhibition that it's actually the bioluminescent organisms that the squid eat that give off that phosphorescence as they decay. And for me, that was kind of an exciting thing to find and read. You never know where the surprises are going to come from. At the same time that I was working with squid, I was interested in sort of the implications of our eyes and vision. And I started making images where I wanted to play with creating images from eyes rather than interpreting images with eyes. I went back to using photogenic drawings or salted paper prints and dissected eyes and placed them on the paper to create sort of an image from this eye itself. In doing this, I wanted to use the photogenic drawing precisely because of its fragility. A photogenic drawing is a little bit different from most photographs in the sense that it's treated instead of fixed. And over time, it will slowly change. So every time you open this book, these books work as light-tight tombs that encase them. Whenever we open them, we are re-exposing it to light and in essence, changing that. And for me, that was akin to a memory or the idea of a story. Because every time we share a story or tell a story, we inevitably do a little bit of damage to it or change it, whether we're expressing something a little bit different or just having fun. And in that expression and in that change, we also give life to it. So in these images, what I was compelled by was the sense that To desire to look at this image would also be to desire its death. But we would be creating life because images only have life when they're seen and when they're interpreted. These images were really the beginning of my working with experimental processes that have continued on into many different ways. I was speaking with Rick Wester the other night, and we were talking about Emmett Gowan, and it reminded me of a quote that Emmett Gowan had said from the author David James Duncan that for me applied to this print. He said, "Through our eyes, we inhale light and images we cannot own. Light and images are shared with every being on earth, and out of our eyes we exhale light, or a darkness that is the spirit in which we perceive. The visual exhalation, this personal energizing and aiming of perception, is the eye speech. It is shaping, it is something, it is eye speech. It is shaping surely as words are shaped by air. My eyesight changes, I'm sorry. I feel responsible for my vision. My eyesight changes the world. Seeing is blood sport." It's from a beautiful book, My Story is Told by Water. Now with these photogenic drawings, I wanted to give you an idea of how they do change over time, because sometimes the change is quite beautiful and other times the change is maybe a little disappointing. But in that shift, there's always a surprise. And for me, I'm pretty interested in the idea of letting go of control in many ways. Now, after leaving New Mexico, I moved to Phoenix, Arizona, and returned to my home in the Sonoran Desert. And actually, I moved to Phoenix. I had sworn I would never live in Phoenix, but I moved here to get married, and my wife could talk me into anything, still today. We've been here for 16 years, which was originally a 3-year plan. And I think this is where we're going to stay probably forever. It's a place that I feel my work exists and where I want to be at this point in time. My first years living in Phoenix were a scramble. Like many young artists and photographers, I was doing the adjunct shuffle. I was running back and forth, teaching 4 classes between 3 campuses. And for those first 3 years, I couldn't really focus on work. I made individual pieces, small things, but it was hard to dive back into a body of work. I became interested in creating standalone objects. But it wasn't until 2006 when I received a fellowship from the American Scandinavian Foundation that I was able to really focus on work and find sort of my footing again. At this point in time, I had written a proposal to create work in Iceland that was sort of multi-purpose. I wanted to find my great-grandmother's homeland. I wanted to see if I could find the farm that she lived on. And I had read about this phosphorescent moss, which I assumed would glow in the dark. After I received the grant, I decided I should probably study about this a little bit more. And it turns out that there's no moss that glows in the dark. So that was okay. I still had the grant and was able to go and scramble. And I used that time as a celebration of making work and ended up making sort of 4 groupings of work that have found their interweavings into a single book. The first grouping in this work are the movements. And they were simple photographs that I made as I was traveling through the landscape, camping the entire time and hiking. I made multiple photographs, but then I chose one from every day. So there are 27 in the series. I'll only show you a couple of them now. But I was interested in Iceland's landscape in its sort of young and volatile nature. I was interested in looking at shifts in the land that were both geological and human-made, that were sometimes surprising. This image lives in my son's room. I think they like it because it looks like matchbox cars. And this final image that I have from this group was made on my wife's birthday when she joined me for the last week. And we got to hike the Laugardalr Trail, which was very beautiful. Now within that, as I was making images every day, every morning when I'd wake up, I'd find a biological specimen and attach it to my backpack in a contact print frame, making what I found out later were called lumen prints. I hadn't heard the term before. Now with the lumen print, I would attach to my backpack as I hiked, and I felt that this was in some ways a conspirator or a talisman to travel with me. But the best thing it did was it opened up conversations with people because everybody was curious to know what that thing was hanging off of your backpack. And I made one of these for every day that I was traveling through this space. These are small 4x5 lumen prints. The paper was originally cut to work in my camera so I could shoot on photographic paper negatives in camera. The third body that is intertwined with this are the cairns. And the cairns were made to sort of delineate the paths that I traveled every day. I'm fascinated by cairns because they have multiple meanings. One, they are markers of passageways that shepherds use to travel the landscape. In the Western states, we see them along trails so that we can find our way. It's a marker to turn. In Iceland, you could see them underneath the fog when the fog would be low, so you could find your way across the landscape. But they're also markers of graves. So at the same time, they're a marker of somebody's passage from the landscape and from the land. And for me, that becomes a sort of potent tool, that they mark our passage through the space and from the space. So every day, I made sure to document one of these markers as I moved through that landscape. The last grouping of images that complete this book are images that I made when I go to sleep. And every night as I go to sleep, I set my camera up in my tent, pointing out of the vestibule. And because it was Iceland in the middle of summer, the sun never went down. And I used paper negatives to create photographs of the sun tracking across the sky. Some nights when it would track across the sky, almost nothing would be recorded. And other nights it would burn holes through the paper negatives. It would look something like this. It wasn't until I got home and I was talking with another friend about these images that he told me he just traded paper with this guy who was making crazy sunburn prints, and he got a print from him for trading him a box of paper. And so, of course, that was Chris McCaw, and he stuck with this, and his are much better. But for me, they're only 27, and that's okay. In terms of how these images exist now, they exist in this book form that is 2 accordion fold books that are in a way a continuous way of viewing. They're printed both front and back. So as you flip through the series that are just representing 7 of the days of this travel, when you get to the end, you flip the book and you start the next sequence, creating a sort of continuous or cyclical reading of these images. This was just a small edition. I only made 12 of them, and they were kind of frustrating to make as well, but a great learning process. So today when I work, I still like to engage multiple processes in all different ways of working. This is an image from a number of years ago. That's Oliver down in the corner in my studio in the house. Luckily, I was able to build a new studio where I'm coming from today, but this is now their study. So they study in this space. But I wanted to show the image of the studio so that people could see that the continuation of work is both in camera and experimental. And for me, both of those spaces are very important. I only realized recently that behind Oliver, there's a Patrick Nagatani print here. He was another mentor of mine, and I love seeing that in the background there. It's taken on new meaning. In Arizona, my conversation changed. Before moving here, I never thought that I'd be a photographer who would engage the Southwest or the landscape. But in moving to Arizona and starting to teach at ASU and meeting other photographers in the space, I wanted to join the conversation that was already happening here. I look at photography as a conversation. We're never going to invent something that's completely new or totally original. Instead, we're trying our hand and giving our best to change that conversation or steer it for a little while. There's such a rich history of Western landscape imagery happening in Arizona, it was impossible not to start to engage that. At the same time, I had received a grant to do a project for the city of Phoenix on recycling, and that facilitated my travel into the spaces that I really wanted to be. So I could do my work for the city, but I could also make my own images. These images come from the body of work titled Instar, and they were an exploration of the desert landscape. I'm interested in this space because it is a space that confuses me still, and it's a space that I feel holds many histories, and histories that maybe I don't understand. And through these images, I'm trying to photograph objects or events or phenomena that remain a bit of mystery for me. I'm going to read you a little bit of a statement or a story that went along with this work. It's not the official statement, but I feel that maybe it will give insight into what I was looking at. This first is a quote from Henry Bugby from The Inward Morning, a philosophical exploration in a journal form. He says, "The world does not become less unknown in proportion to the increase of our knowledge about it. Our experience in the world involves us in a mystery which can only be intelligible to us as mystery. The more we experience things in depth, the more we participate in a mystery intelligible only as such. Our true home is wilderness, even in the world of the everyday." I woke before midnight haunted by an encounter with a rattlesnake earlier in the day. The night air was cool, and the Pleiades hung low in the sky, just above a petroglyph of a large cat, reflecting brightly in the moonlight. To the east, flares suspended from large parachutes floated quietly through the darkness as soldiers practiced maneuvers, and the northern horizon glowed orange from the lights of Phoenix. I was camping at Sears Point on the Gila River in southern Arizona. Although I was told the Gila had not flowed this far south in 8 years, that day it was waist deep and 100 yards across. I had been there once before, that scorching June night, and a friend referred to the spot as the place of dust and myth. As I lay on my cot, slipping in and out of dreams, I thought of migrant families crossing the border 30 miles south, and my family to the north, tucked safely in their beds. Early morning before the sun rose, I listened to the yelping cries of a pack of coyotes as they closed in on their prey. My thoughts turned earlier in the week when I encountered a juvenile coyote on an urban trail in the center of Phoenix. I startled the coyote as he crossed my trail with still warm rabbit dangling from its mouth, and then he stopped and stared at me with the intensity peaked from a fresh kill. And in that moment, I thought of Chuck Bowden's asking, "What is it like to kill with your mouth?" As the cars rushed along the nearby avenue, the coyote looked back to its pack once more, as if to say, "This is what is real." Then he too was gone. All that remained was the crimson constellation of blood droplets in the sand. Phoenix, despite its population of nearly 4.3 million, is a desert, and the wild persists in its heart. In this desert, in this space, I can hike and find phenomena like these metal shards reflecting the moonlight in the night sky. These images bridge the gap between Arizona and Mexico, some of these in the Pinacate, a space that for me is wild and mystical. And I feel that I'm called to the desert. It's the place that I want to be. When I'm not making images, I'm out in the desert riding my bicycle. I'm an avid cyclist, mostly riding at night because that's when I can get away. But riding at night provides an experience that's very similar to making photographs because everything is lit by a single sort of spotlight in front of you. One of my favorite experiences as I travel the trails at night is to come through a cloud of dust and recognize that an animal had just been there, that they're off the trail watching you, but you can't see them. That to me felt magical and is something that I look for as I'm out in these spaces. This is the last of the instar images that I'll show you. And for me, it's one that sort of epitomizes what I was looking for while making these images. I was sitting at a desert campsite outside of Phoenix with a close friend, and we were watching a thunderstorm roll in down over to the east. It took a long time before we realized that the planes were making racetracks in the sky, going back and forth and around because they couldn't land at the airport in Phoenix. Once we realized this, we both jumped up and tried to make a photograph. And luckily, I feel that this one worked out. While we were in the middle of nowhere, we also recognized that we're never really that far away. We're always in contact with civilization, and it's impossible to get away from. So moving into the work that more people are familiar with, it's going to be the work that comes from works of fire. Now, this work comes from multiple places and has a handful of inspirations, but its genesis really came from doing a piece for the Huffington Post. I was invited to do a piece in response to a poem from the Huffington Post. And I was given a poem by the poet, Nicole Walker, titled Germination. Her poem or her writing was about the collection of heritage seeds and saving them for future times. And the last lines I'll read for you here. "We were out of seeds, and even if we had seeds, the rain that the weathermen had promised are coming not from the sky, but from the ground. Great big bubbles of trouble, hot and shooting like geysers or other unseemly projectiles. Still, we can't overworry. Perhaps with the ground cracking hot waters, there's a new seed or new food or a new light. It's dark and cold, and we're a little hungry, but there's always tomorrow." With this poem, I had 24 hours to respond, and I didn't want to make a typical response, photographing something that exists in the world. Instead, I wanted to create an image that was the direct result of energy. something that is more like that new light that she was speaking of. And so I went into my backyard and started playing with gunpowder. I had learned years earlier that you could harvest gunpowder from shotgun shells because one New Year's Eve, my father wanted to make some noise in the backyard. And so before we went out, he pulled out a shotgun shell and dissected it on the kitchen counter, taking out all of the bird shot so it was no longer potent or dangerous. He put it into the shotgun. We walked in the backyard and waited for midnight. And at midnight, he shot the gun, and to our surprise, there really wasn't a bang. It was more of like a poof, and like a couple sparks flew out the end. And I remember him looking at me and saying, "Oh, well, that was something." And for me, that was a wild event for my father because he's a very serious man, and he generally didn't do things like that. And so it's something that stuck with me forever. But the other thing I learned that night was that I could harvest gunpowder from those shells and cut them open. And I started a little sort of cottage industry with a few friends of making fireworks at home. None of them were really good. Mostly they just made burn marks on the ground. But I remembered those events, and it made me think about creating images with this gunpowder. This is the first one, the origin of these images. And it sits with me in my studio, and it's one that I'll keep. Over the years, I continued to work with this gunpowder, finding new ways of creating images, of trying to control the explosion. And really, primarily, I was fascinated with sort of the dual nature of creation and destruction. In making images in these ways, I had to obliterate something to make something new. And I was excited about this element of finding beauty out of that sense of destruction. So each of these images in the series is made by igniting small portions of gunpowder directly on the surface of silver gelatin paper. And the resulting explosion and the light and energy, they both burn and abrade the paper, and they're recorded as this sort of photographic image. Now, I'm not the first person to work in ways that are similar to this. I think it's not a new practice. I think it falls in line with artists like Thomas Barrow and Robert Heineken, Baldessari and Rauschenberg, are all artists who Adam Bell, in his essay, Photographs About Photographs, suggest challenge and inspire a generation of artists to alter the medium both materially and conceptually from the inside out. These photographers were photographic makers rather than takers, self-consciously calling attention to the process or idea of creating, of the creative act. Heineken and Barrow used the material and pictorial limits of photography to push it to its breaking point. I was fortunate to study with Thomas Barrow at the University of New Mexico. And I remember the first time I saw his work, I didn't know how to handle it. He was giving a lecture at Washington University. He was visiting his friend Joe Deal. And his work, when he showed it, were these crazy photograms with paint, and they were kind of garish. And I found them really challenging. And I think, Dave, actually, I think I responded maybe to his work like you responded to mine. I wasn't sure if I could take it at first. And the more I thought about it and the more time I spent with it, the more important it became to me. And in that lecture, he also said something else. He said, live a normal life so you can make outrageous work. I think he was actually quoting somebody else, but for me, that'll forever come from Thomas Barrow. And at that point, I decided that I wanted to go to graduate school at the University of New Mexico so I could study with him, which I was lucky to before he retired. As I experimented with his processes, I found some things were surprising. First, of course, the gunpowder and light exposed the paper, but there are other reactions that I didn't expect. One of the big reactions is heat. Some of the photographic papers that I work with are greatly fogged, and the heat retards the exposure and allows an image to be recorded of that heat. This piece is the first piece that was very controlled that I worked with, and I made this after returning from the desert from a trip with a number of friends. I had stopped outside of Phoenix, and we met up with Barbara Bosworth, who was teaching at the University of Arizona that year, and we were traveling with Chris McCaw and Mike Lundgren, and it happened to be on the solar eclipse that coincided with the winter solstice. So of course, if you know Barbara's work and Chris's work, they brought out their huge cameras and pointed them up at the sky to make photographs of this eclipse. And I just thought, shucks, I don't have anything to do here. And instead I went home and the next week made my own eclipse in the backyard, which for me was very liberating. And it opened up great possibilities in terms of creating images and starting to build images from these multiple spaces, multiple pieces. Some of the images are very simple. They're made by burying the earth in the ground or the paper in the ground and creating a small explosion, where others use materials that I've meticulously punched out or made holes in to direct blast. Each time I work, I feel like I'm orchestrating a new event. In many ways, I feel like a director or orchestrator more than anything else, because I'm taking these mixed elements and trying to bring them together. And I have an idea of what's going to happen, but I'm never sure. There's always a mystery in it, and it's always a surprise. But my hope is that as time goes on, I start to understand those surprises a little bit more. The first exhibition of this work was at the Griffin Museum, and I borrowed the title for that exhibition, Nothing is the Rule, from Carl Sagan's book, The Varieties of Scientific Experience. Sagan's book is a meditation on the relationship of religion and science. And in this book, he really elegantly writes about the misperception of the night sky as being filled by light. What he says is, the universe is mainly made of nothing. Something is the exception. Nothing is the rule. That darkness is commonplace and light is the rarity. This is something that stuck with me through the work because I feel that creating these images is sort of, for me, casting wonder through these sparks. Sometimes I'm totally surprised by what happens. My goal then is to move backwards and figure out how I can reproduce that and make it happen again and understand the process in a more full and rich way. This set of images for me is a little bit different, and it goes back to the idea of heat. These were made on a very expired AGFA paper, really beautiful Portuga Rapid paper. But if I developed it by itself without exposing it at all, the pieces were pretty much directly black. There was nothing to do with it. So in exposing these, I used a gunpowder that created a high heat that burned for longer periods of time. And that heat was recorded by slowing down the process and allowing that paper to still show through. When I realized this would happen, I also realized that I could build other contraptions to control the movement of heat and light and the gases as they move through chambers and objects that I use to direct blasts in different ways. This is a piece, Emergent Field, that was shown at the New Mexico Museum of Art in Santa Fe. Now, most of this work I'm doing at night, and this is my glorious darkroom. I have to work outside at night in darkness because it's too messy to work with inside, and there's too much smoke. I like to work in the landscape when I'm traveling, but when I'm home, I need to find a way of continuing this work. And I felt like this was really a snazzy picture because my darkroom had a new tarp and looked really crisp. I was proud of this darkroom that day. Today, I'm very fortunate because it's grown an appendage and I actually have a space to work in now. But it doesn't have a darkroom. My darkroom is still outside. It's the thing off to the edge over here. As you can see, the working space for the darkroom itself. The silhouette on the floor there is actually a silhouette of my son, Oliver. We've been drawing silhouettes of each other since about July, sort of playing with images here. But that brings me back to another body of work that's dealing with this gunpowder and working with the gunpowder. After experimenting and working in many different ways and trying to see how far I could push this explosive process, I wanted to really refine it and see what I could do with the most simple of forms. At this point in time, I started making these images that were titled Dark Hours Horizons. In doing these, I would sit sort of under the gnarled trees, branches of my tree, and I'm just going to read this for you because I feel like it'll give you a better sense. Sitting under the gnarled branches of a large mesquite, I watched the silver of a waxing moon dip low on the horizon. A summer storm has forced pause in my work. First, the wind and dust turned the tarp into my impromptu darkroom into a billowing creature punctuated with the light and smoke of fiery exposures. Now the rain with large inconsistent drops, pulls dust from the sky, creating crowns of mud on the surface of my paper. These storms appear with a violent certainty and dissipate into swift, quiet silence, a cycle of the summer I have come to love. This summer, I worked through multiple projects, and in my production, I was driven by the cycles of weather and the moon. I waited for the dark hours when the moon was low in the sky and the sun turned its reflective gaze reduced to darkness. I toiled through storms in these precious hours through the summer solstice. My conspirator, a night blooming cirrus, grown from cuttings I have carried from my childhood home, shared my productive cycle, awaiting the dark hours to explode. The cirrus, a great white blossom with its great white blossoms, opened once a night during the hot months of the summer, only to close with the rising sun the following morning. The blooms have always been a sign of warm nights and the exhaustion of summer, bringing the memory of a neighbor who was a monumental figure for me. Her yard glowed with fragrant white explosions in the light of the growing moon. This work, which started as an exploration, pulling at the base elements of the photographic medium, evolved to explore energy, fluid, motion, light, chaos, reactive materials, and violence. The work is a reprieve from many of my other endeavors, offering a move towards meditative simplicity. Seduced by the reduction of fire and chaos into a single line, a delineation, a separation, and a horizon that resonates with the desert landscape, the storms that give pause, and the Western states that are on fire. The single line disrupting the traditional flat surface of the paper pulls attention to its creation while opening the possibility of discovery through the suggestion of depth. I follow these images night after night, repeating, refining small explosions, meditating on a single evolving line until the sun's reflection in the moon was too bright to work. All the shadows grew around me so that I could once again sit back and enjoy the explosion of white in my conspirator's blossoms and wait for the moon to wane into darkness. Many of these images are singular, but I've also found it rewarding to piece them together into multiples, building sort of impromptu landscapes. At the time I was making these images, my children were pretty young, and I wasn't able to get out and make the images that I wanted to make with camera in the landscapes. And they were, in a way, sort of a replacement for that time in that space. They're a place for me to find calm and pause. This is perhaps one of my favorites because it is so subtle. There's almost nothing happening. So moving on to more recent work, we can jump into the body of work titled Beyond Reckoning. And Beyond Reckoning has the citizens involved in this. And the citizen is the piece that was in the recent auction at SF Camerawork. This work was a long time in the making, and its origin probably comes from a traditional photograph that I made in 2010, which is this photograph. I was hiking in the land, making photographs, and I came across this target that was laying on the ground. And I was really startled when I picked it up and lifted it. When I was laying on the ground, I thought it was just a normal target. But as I lifted it, I realized that there was a heart cut out in the plywood behind the target that Osama bin Laden. And as I lifted it, it started to illuminate and be filled with this light. And I was startled by sort of the contradiction of this image, the sort of beauty of that light and that space and the warmth, but also the horror and violence embedded in it. I didn't know how to deal with this photograph, so it sat in a flat file for the next 5 years. But every once in a while, I would go into the landscape and kick through these desert target ranges to see what I could find. And finally, in 2015, I decided I needed to start working with those targets, but I didn't want to photograph them. Instead, I wanted to make something that allowed them to transcend the original object and become something else. This is an image that was made from a 20 by 24 inch on 20 by 24 inch paper with a fairly large target. With the gunpowder on top, the target works as a paper negative, filtering out light and allowing it to record an image. While I still do photograph some of the objects in those spaces, I felt like making traditional photographs was just all too many bullet holes. And I really wanted to focus on finding a way of embedding the violence within this paper and bringing it back. Now, in 2015, I felt like things were changing in the United States. And I felt like things were becoming increasingly divided and violent. I had no idea we'd land in the space that we're at today, which I find to be even more and more troubling. I started bringing these targets home and working with them in my backyard, creating exposures. And then some other unique things happened. I started working with targets that had characters on them. This image was actually shown at SF Camerawork in the Forecast show a good number of years ago. And it's still, for me, one of the strongest pieces in the group. This was made of your prototypical bad guy target. And I exposed it multiple times with gunpowder. And each time, more of the target burned away. But in each exposure, a new element of this aggressor, of this assailant, is revealed. And only together through the 5 panels can you really see a full picture. To me, this referenced comic books, sort of the film strip. It also referenced sort of violent acts and how oftentimes those can be broken into staggering memories. The assailant pictures often appear with multiples so that the aggressor will both appear and disappear into that space. Other things that I made photographs from, or these images from, included wedding photographs. This was a wedding photograph that I used on both positive, direct positive, and negative paper. All we see here is the wedding bouquet that the bride was holding at her waist. I'm surprised by the number of wedding photographs I found in the desert as people decide they no longer want to be together. Other things are simple, like bulletproof glass that people test to see what it can really work with. And I still make photographs in these spaces that for me resonate. Before we came on, I was speaking with Dave about mannequin heads that we find in the desert. This is a photograph from one of the mannequin heads using gunpowder to create this exposure. The images that are made from mannequin heads I titled Revenings. And for me, they're some of the most disturbing images in this whole group. And I honestly have a little bit of a hard time dealing with them. I've never shown them in exhibition. I have had them on websites and shown them to a few people who've come into my studio. But for me, they're contentious and make me uncomfortable. I love them and I also hate them at the same time. And dealing with those types of emotions is an interesting thing. Some of them feel depraved because in those images, we end up creating photographs from hair. This is perhaps, for me, in the Revening series, the most powerful because this figure becomes masked by the residue that's going across the eyes and in that space. I was feeling pretty heavy with these images until I had the surprise of finding these life-size targets, which ended up being the citizens. The citizens, for me, are the epitome of this work, and in some ways, they're the savior of this work. The citizens break away, I think, from the totally violent nature of everything else and allow for a transformation. In many ways, I feel like these citizens are actually revenant forms that are sort of springing to life, not as victims anymore, but instead as apparitions haunting this space. I like to think about the landscape holding memories and holding history. And I think these are relics of the violent history that's been enacted in this space. The Beyond Reckoning work is done. I'm not working on it anymore except for these citizens. Because I feel that now, at this day and age, anytime I find these larger pieces, these larger targets, I'm going to continue the citizen work and continue making them. And I'm not sure where we'll end up with that, but I do kind of love this continuous act of making. Each takes on its own life, its own sort of meaning. And another thing that's strange for me in making these is that when I wash these at night, I have a big tray in the backyard that I have to sit over and rock back and forth. And I spend 2 hours at night washing prints because I don't have a file or an archival washer that's large enough for these. So I wash and I rub them and I sort of take care of them. And it feels like I'm taking care of the wounds on these photographs, washing away all of the debris, pouring that out and rewashing and taking care. And it's sort of a meditative act in the end, something that I find for me to be redeeming. They go back and forth between paper that is a traditional black and white paper, and then paper that is direct positive paper, which is what creates the shift from the white figure to the black figure and back and forth in that space. Now, working on all of these does take its toll. I wanted to show a couple installation shots from these exhibitions. This is the exhibition from Beyond Reckoning that was at Rick Wester. And I was pretty excited about the constellations and the pieces and how they came together in this space. I thought it worked quite well. It was a small exhibition, but I loved bringing together the different pieces and allowing it to create an experience in the space. For me, I often think about photographs in forms of exhibitions rather than in books, because I like to think about the images that are behind me or across from me, the reflections I might see, versus working linearly through a book. And here's an installation image from the Griffin Museum a number of years earlier to give you a sense of scale in these prints. This piece was titled Tight Grouping. It's really a pain to hang on the wall if you have to do all those frames together. I have to apologize to people whenever I send it to them. And the last of the targets. Now, in doing this work, I feel that the Beyond Reckoning work did take sort of a psychic toll on me. And so I had to even that out by making images that as well went back and engaged a form of beauty that was more meditative. And those images came back to the form of the Ouroboros. The Ouroboros is known as the snake that swallowed its tail or the serpent that swallowed its tail. In some cultures, it's seen as a snake. In others, it is a dragon-like creature. But the Ouroboros is the ancient alchemist symbol of representation of an eternal return. It's a sign of infinity. The serpent devouring its tail completes the cycle of birth and death, finding nourishment through its own flesh, illustrating the dual nature of creation and destruction. The oldest known Ouroboros image came from King Tut's tomb on a golden shrine. In Norse mythology, the serpent Jormungandr encircles the world with its tail in its mouth, while in Hinduism, the Ouroboros form is part of the foundation upon which the earth set. This is a character that appears over and over again in different mythologies. Perhaps my favorite is the Mesoamerican depiction of Quetzalcoatl, the winged beast, the winged serpent, or the precious serpent that is both the creator and the destroyer, who recreated man after their demise. In these images, I come back to the sort of simplicity of the horizons, repeating a single form over and over again, but looking for that infinite return, the shift that's always different. It's also a return to one of my earliest pieces, which was this. This is from Meditations on the Northern Hemisphere, a simpler piece, but a piece that used a piece of metal that I had punched out all of the constellations of the Northern Hemisphere. So all of the little dots in there are a map of the stars. In the Ouroboros, this return for me was putting those stars in the center of this serpent, which is actually a bandsaw blade that I've worked together that works as a burner as it pushes heat and fire out of its sides. I am infinitely excited about the change in these and the possibilities with each of these being a little bit different. I've completed these and I have a pile of them that I'm whittling down so that there'll only be a handful in the final sort of edition of these images, which I want to keep fairly limited. However, because of this sort of great mass of images that I make, I end up having material to work with. And I always want to find something to complete that. So over the last couple of years, I've been working to make 3 large serpents. And these large serpents come from the refuse of the Ouroboros prints. They're mapped together to create larger pieces. And I happen to just like this photograph because it had American photography and new topographics in there, all things that I feel are sort of my foundations in imagery, to create larger pieces on their own. There are only going to be 3 of these. This one is complete. And the other two serpents I'm still working on, or well, they're complete as well, but I don't have good photographs of them. And one of my complaints in showing photographs online is that you never understand them because of that flatness. So I'm going to click this as a little video so you can see sort of the depth that they have. So hopefully that didn't make anybody too dizzy. Oh, well, I won't make you do it again. And here's the final of the three pieces. So with that, I think I'd like to end with one more quote. And this is a quote from the writer William Kittredge and from his book, The Nature of Generosity. And I think that for me, it reflects on the way that I look at work. In this quote, he says, "We ride our stories like rafts or lay them out on the table like maps. They always eventually fail and have to be reinvented. The world is too complex for our forms to ever encompass for long. Storytelling requires continuous reimagining. The process of reinvention is often formalized as in call and response in blues music, statement and confrontation, improvisation and play, then the introduction of a new element. Our willingness to think freshly, if our willingness to think freshly deserts us, or if we refuse outright, we are left adrift." This brings me back to James Welling's reconfiguring of the medium for each project. And for me, that becomes a very important thing. I feel that I'm due for a shift in work, and I'm excited about that, but also terrified by it, because it always means change is frightening. My favorite place, however, in creating work is the feeling that I'm onto something new, the feeling that something is around the corner, but I don't fully understand it. Once I understand it completely or have complete control over it, I feel like it's time to set it down, let it have its life, and move on to the next sort of invention or adventure. So thank you for listening. I feel like I was talking really fast and giving you a lot of information, so I'm happy to take any questions if any of them come up.
Chris, that was great, and you spoke so eloquently. I felt a little bit like we were listening to a podcast about photography with all these amazing images. Can I
Thank
ask you just for a moment to maybe stop sharing? We can come
you.
back
Sure.
together and have a conversation, and we can always go back and look at the work. Thank you so much for that. And for anybody who has a question, please go ahead, just put it in the chat, and we can come together and talk about it. I'd like to kick us off with a question, because you were so generous in sharing the evolution of your work. And the first time I encountered your work, and I think this might have been a reaction that others had as well, I was uncomfortable that you were making something beautiful from a source that was so violent, these beautiful auroras and fluid motions that was coming from a material that was really fraught. But then it grew on me because you're taking something back, you're creating something beautiful out of that violence. And I think you summarized that so well when you concluded with that serpent piece and the way you were guiding that violence with the saw blades. When we were talking about Arizona and you were telling me about the objects that you were picking up in the desert and you mentioned those mannequin heads, I thought, well, it just couldn't occur to me as someone who's lived in cities and lives here in San Francisco, like why on earth would you come across mannequin heads in the desert? And it's because they are like the other targets you found.
Mm-hmm.
And that work, as you said, it was uncomfortable. I started to feel uncomfortable because it takes the sort of implicit violence of the gunpowder that your early work and your current work is, and now with the targets and particularly the mannequin heads, the material of the gunpowder now seems tied so explicitly to the violence with the targets. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit more to the relationship you had with these bodies of work. Um, it's not lost on me that there are sirens going by my house right now. Forgive me.
Wasn't sure if that was you or me. Yeah.
But yeah, it just seems like there was a shift. You know the materials you're working with, but now you're collecting these targets. It adds a dimension that it sounds like you're still working through.
Yeah. Well, no, I do think it adds dimension, and it is something that I'm still uncomfortable with because um, I don't feel that I ever want to profit from others' misery in a way. But it makes me think about other work that's fraught in the same way. If we think back to work like Emmett Gowan's images of bomb testing sites, or if we think about Richard Mizrak's work in the deserts, those works are extremely beautiful and they're engaging that similar sense of violence. And I think that sometimes that beauty gives us a way of digesting what's actually happening. And so I do think that the search for beauty within it is important. Um, I'm more comfortable with the citizens because for me, they sort of transform from that direct violence, even though it is implicit, it's right there. There's something that happens that's a little bit different in them than the mannequin heads. And I admit that I still struggle with the mannequin heads. I'm not willing to put them away because I feel they're important. Part of that struggle is what makes me hold on to things. You know, I've never wanted to be the artist that makes statements and gives numbers and works out things in those ways. Instead, I want to make things that are really more of an interpersonal reaction to what's happening in the world. And for me, I feel like I understand images much more clearly than I understand words. And that's the place that I can put that. Because I believe that there is that sort of language that is just visual, that can do things that I can't do in the way that I speak.
You know, that's a perfect transition to the question that Wendy just posted to the chat. And she was just speaking to, well, you can see it there. Your talk, so much of what adds to the work is when you tell the story around the work. And it seems like you're really good with words, actually, and sharing that. But Wendy, do you want to maybe elaborate that if you feel comfortable unmuting and asking a question about the relationship between narrative and Chris's work? You needn't.
Hi, hi, sure. Hi,
Is that
Chris.
Wendy Kawabata?
It is.
We haven't years, so this still now. Yeah, no, just a couple of days ago, I was listening to an artist talk with the photographer Lucas Blaylock, who has a show here in a series, Out of the Camera, and there weren't narratives in the way he talked about his work. He talked about the work as non-linguistic, and it was much, much more about responding to painting, responding to the history of painting, showing work rather than hiding work in a digital sense. And so that was the thing, listening to you talk, was such a primary position storytelling has in your practice. So yeah, I'm just really curious about that in terms of, you know, do stories come out of, well, I mean, I know where stories come from. They can come from lots of different places. They come out of process. Sometimes they seem like they come out of process for you. Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks.
Yeah, you know, I think, Wendy, I miss you dearly, by the way. I just want to say that first. You know, it's a mixture. I think that the stories for me create a narrative that allow me to continue to follow the work. I feel that, you know, most of the work that we make, whether it's a response to the history of art or work that's made before us, we're in essence, or I'm trying to, in essence, make it part of my story and take my own story. I have a hard time differentiating from work that is fully about the medium and doesn't entail some form of narrative system to it. Or no, I don't want to say narrative, but some sort of legend to it in a way. Because I think that, you know, we are in essence the legends that we tell ourselves and how we build these stories and how we build these images. And I don't know that I'm going in the direction that you're asking your question. But I think that story is so important for me. And for me, it's also really important to write about the work because it takes me forever to write and I'm very slow. But over a long process, I can finally come to a place where I have a greater understanding. And often that's embedded within the personal experience.
There's something about story that seems necessary. Like your work, I think, at first sight, particularly the body of work you shared, where it's just a thin line, and it almost looks like a long exposure of rain or clouds moving by. I think if you didn't know that this came from gunpowder, your the way you'd interpret the image is different. And so the story of how the print was made does really feel like a part of the work. Um, Another question, move on to a little bit. It was wonderful to see the through line of your work, the physicality of your work, from hanging contact frames on your backpack to guiding to the squid, which was lovely to see, to now sort of guiding uh, gunpowder. And Nana asked a question about your style. How did you what drew you to this? Because it feels like there's a through line of physicality, of unique materials, and how does your style develop? What ties together the contact frames, the squid, the gunpowder? We can see it. I wonder if you can speak a little bit more to that journey and what led you to it.
Well, I think in one thing, um, I'm always suspect of style, you know, and my general aim is often to avoid it. But I think those things sort of fall in line because I'm really interested in the physicality of work. Oftentimes, working in this traditional flat photograph for me, when they're completely transformative, they're amazing. But I'm an object maker oftentimes, and I'm sort of drawn to making things. And I make things for different people as sort of part of what I do. And it's hard for me to not think about sort of fiddling with my hands. Right now, I've got a paper towel and like some chapstick because like I'm always dealing with things that are a little bit tactile. Um, I think part of that aesthetic comes from a space that is really very much about things that are natural and the earth. And I work with materials that are oxidizing and creating different sort of tonal ranges. But it's funny, it's not always been intentional. When I was getting married in that last year of graduate school, I ended up throwing porcelain vessels, porcelain teacups for all of our guests at our wedding. And they were glazed in a glaze that was made from volcanic ash in New Mexico. And their palette is exactly the same of the images that I make now. And I had no idea that that would be sort of connected in. They could sit next to my pieces and work, but there's always been maybe an attraction to that sort of tonal range, that palette. Part of it, I don't know if I can explain. I think it's a general curiosity that keeps me trying new things.
Is there something about when I look at your work, you mentioned several contemporary artists, Chris McCaw and others.
Mhm.
I'm thinking about the serpent print you made. If we
Mhm.
see that as an object, it's a beautiful object. It's an object that draws you in. You might see the paper, the scorch marks. How do you feel when someone asks, "Well, what is that?" Do you when you explain, "Well, those are bandsaw blades that are guiding the force and heat of gunpowder, and then I put them together this way," or do you try to avoid that explanation of the process? When you're tied to the process, people want to know about the process. What's your relationship with sort of revealing the magic as opposed to maybe just letting something stand and be a beautiful object on its own?
Well, the truth is, I often try to sort of avoid that conversation because I want there to be a mystery that remains in the work. I remember seeing a lecture by Yamamoto, and they were asking some of the secrets in his work and how he did things. And all I could think was, no, don't tell us. Please don't tell us, because oftentimes within work, it's that magic or that not knowing that really remains that mystery. I want work to challenge me so that when I look at it, I don't understand it completely, because that will keep me coming back and asking questions over and over again. And to that point, we had briefly discussed possibly making a video demonstration. And I decided not to do that primarily because
Mm.
I kind of want to keep that, as that space. I want it to remain a little bit of mystery. I was very hesitant to ever say anything about the bandsaw blade as well, but I got outed once, and so
Mm.
now I don't care on that one anymore.
It's it's interesting, and I think it can lead us into a question from Rick. It's almost like you're preserving the ceremony of creating the work is yours,
Mhm.
and that is its own thing that isn't shared. And I wonder if that ties into Rick's question. He says it seems like each body of work relies more and more on myth as a source. and I suspect maybe you and he have talked about this. Can you speak to the role of myth and storytelling in your thinking? And this feels similar to Wendy's question as well, and even a little bit of my question of what's the story of how you made this and the story of how you discovered this. And it feels like it does ladder up to this notion of myth making for you.
No, I agree. I think that there is very much an element of myth making, but maybe even more than myth making, an element of ritual, of finding these practices that I can work on over and over again as a way of finding a sort of a meditative release. And that ritual becomes something that is this practice that's almost spiritual in a way. It becomes a very delicate practice, even though I'm working with things that are rough and like explosions. So I think the mythology in it is really important for me.
What's the ritual?
I've always, yeah, the ritual.
The ritual leads to the myth making. The words seem entwined.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think about it even in terms of looking at animal trails or game trails in the hills when I'm out hiking. The things that I'm drawn to that I want to photograph as well are the things that have evidence of others being in that space. It's not necessarily petroglyphs, but it's more like an animal trail. I think about Robert Long's actions as he would walk trails over and over again and carve his own sort of feet into that land and leave his mark in that space. I think maybe there's something that's akin to what he was working with.
I'm reminded now of what you said about finding a cloud of dust and an animal has been there when you were riding your bike. That was a incredible image, and what you just said evoked that again.
Oh, it's one of my favorite things. I spend a lot of times on the trail at night, and with just that headlamp on, you never know what you're going to find. And even at my home, we have things like I finished printing, late at night a couple days ago, and there was this screeching from the backyard. I thought an animal was dying. And there was this beautiful great horned owl just perched up in the tree, just watching me. And it was just this beautiful experience that I could just stand in front of. Those are the things that I want to experience. And those experiences are sort of what I want the work to feel like, but I'm not always sure how to get there.
Can you tell us a little bit more about your relationship with the desert? You didn't want to be in Arizona, but it's still desert, and you're accepting it. It feels like work is fueled by the environment you're in.
Yeah, the Sonoran Desert is absolutely where I've always wanted to be. Phoenix in particular, I was a little bit hesitant to. I'm from Tucson, and of course there's a little, rivalry there between the two. But this space, growing up, I grew up in Tucson, surrounded by the Catalina Mountains. And I think the richest memories I have to do with experiencing that desert space when monsoon rains would come in and the air would change, everything would cool, when the smell of the creosote getting damp would change that space. Those are, those are really primary experiences for me. And I can't think of any space that I'd rather be in now, to be honest. There's a mystery, that happens out in the desert. And one of the things I think I'm drawn to is just this sense that life is so tenuous here. This year we've had a terrible, terrible drought. And as you move around, the desert's taken on a fully different tone. The cactus are suffering, sorrows are falling and leaning. We just have had excessive heat and no rain, and it's changing that space. But as I read, mentioned before, I've been camping in areas that haven't had water in over 20 years that were flooded the times that I've been there. So it's always surprising. It's a place that's unpredictable. And there's a sense of beauty. And I think the beauty is embedded in this space because sometimes it is so desperate.
It strikes me you wouldn't find the artifacts, or you just wouldn't find the same artifacts that inspire your work in other environments. There is something about the open desert.
There is. And there's something about Arizona as well, and the politics here that drive people to go out and shoot strange things in the desert that might not happen in other spaces. While I love this land and I love the desert, I'm not a fan of the politics here. And that is something that I really struggle with in being an individual in Arizona.
Well, it may change. We can still vote coming up. And we'll keep the focus to photography for now. I want to come back a little bit to the materials. Mitzi had a question uh, about the papers that you use and what you're looking for. And I wanted to tack on to that a little bit. And feel free to answer this how you like, because I think it is also a little bit like asking you to reveal some of the ritual. And I know that photographers, image makers, sometimes don't always want to reveal everything about the process. But I wonder if you can talk a little bit about your relationship with the papers you're using, the way you think about how to channel the gunpowder, um, the, the artifacts you're finding in the desert. I'm curious, where are you getting your gunpowder now? Are you still cutting up shotgun shells? Because that seems ill-advised. How's your working process evolved?
Well, with the papers, I'll work with just about anything that lands in my lap. And the truth is, the older papers that stopped being made in the 80s are really the best because they have the worst chemicals in them and they make beautiful, strange things. So everybody's looking for those to make lumen prints and everything else. So there's a little bit of a wrestling match, I think, for artists to find those things anymore. I do have sort of favorite papers that have come to work for specific things. And I think part of the process when I'm working with new objects or sort of a new group is to figure out what paper is going to give me the best palette, how it's going to work through, and how it's going to start to sort of work. And I end up having sort of boxes of tests. I save tons of things. Let me grab something here. So like I can pull out, all different types of things and papers that I've tested on, just as a way of sort of creating that palette. And so I have a hard time throwing anything away because it might lead back to that discovery. So, for Mitzi, it's each paper is a little bit different. And then the reaction with the different types of gunpowders are very different too, because their composition is very different. Then also the other thing that it's always surprising is I'm often making prints here in Arizona during the summer, and my chemistry outside has got to be 100 degrees because that's the air temperature. And so that affects everything as well. So I like printing in the summer because I get the craziest results. Some of the things I don't understand, but other parts of the process I've started to nail down and figure out where they're
I
headed.
just wanted to say, I had done a lot of printing with silver gelatin prints when I first began photography, and I have a nostalgia for it. And you're working with the metallicness of the explosion and visually being able to see that, I just think is very wonderful.
Oh,
the sensual part and the visual and the elemental.
Well, I think that surface of these papers is really important to the work, and I feel like when people see them in person, they have a very different reaction to them than when they see them as a representation, because the sheen changes. Sometimes there's a separation of the gelatin that creates sort of an iridescent cast that's impossible to reproduce when we're looking at a piece. And that's partially why I wanted to show the video of the larger serpent, because those are little effects and they're pits and valleys that we'll never see online. You can only see in person.
Well, I hope I'll get to do that someday.
Well, if you're ever in Arizona, you can come over.
All right.
Thanks, Bitsy.
Yeah.
We have about 15 minutes left. We can keep talking a little bit. Does anybody else have a question they want to post to the chat or otherwise indicate? Something just came from Georgia. I could read it out loud. Georgia, do you feel comfortable unmuting and asking that question? Give it a minute. For now, I'll go ahead and read it. You mentioned, oh, no problem, Georgia. Thank you for posting the question. You mentioned early there were times, mostly transitional seasons, where you weren't making as many images and changed over to individual standalone objects. Can you talk a little bit about your thought process during that time and how and what made the transition back to creating more images and making bodies of work again? I think we've all faced that as creators. How do we get ourselves moving when we need to?
Sure, absolutely. I think, as a maker, we find ourselves wrapped up in what turn out to be sort of grand bodies of work, or we hope they become grand bodies of work. There's something that we can focus our energy on for long periods of time. But inevitably in between those, we're going to grasp at things and have to sort of pick and choose what works for us and just experiment. So, it's one of the things that I think about often in terms of students is the hardest thing to do is to get started. And the best thing you can do is just make things, even if you don't know where they're going to lead you. And so for me, the standalone objects often come maybe from a question that somebody posed for me, or a thought or a quote that I read in a book. And I just think, well, okay, how can I go engage this and make something that works from that? And who knows where that will take me? Every once in a while, it might lean to something great. And other times it's, going to fizzle out. But I think it's important to keep making no matter what. And so those standalone pieces are oftentimes when I'm struggling to figure out what the next larger, tail I'm going to chase is, sort of trying to find that next ritual to work with.
Speaking of working with rituals, I think this is a question that artists who are working in your space, where it's not exactly a photograph, it's photographic elements that are recording light and heat and different things. Do you consider this is from Nate Love, do you consider yourself an artist or a photographer? I'm going to add on to it. Is there a distinction in those things? How do you relate to those terms?
I have colleagues that I'd argue and have argued with over this. For me, I don't really want to make a distinction. My love first comes from the medium of photography. So I very much see myself as a photographer, but I'm not willing to out myself as anything other than an artist at the same time. And I think that's one of the compelling things is oftentimes when we have people who are working within the photographic medium, they either work very traditionally or they work completely experimentally. And I think that there can be a space where we can do both things and appreciate that to push the medium. I like listening to people's conversations when I go to lectures and hear them talk about what the artist has said. And they'll say, oh, that person's not a photographer. They're not using a camera. And I just think, oh, I'm sorry that your view is that way, but that's okay.
It's okay.
Yeah, it's okay. Yeah.
Okay. But it is, it's interesting in terms of how we're creating and capturing images. It's one of those things I think we can always argue about late at night, if we want to get down to it. But in the end, to me, what makes it photographic is that you're capturing something real that happened. There's an artifact that's generated and recorded chemically of an event that took place. And for me, that always feels photographic, even if it gets abstract.
Well, I think that's one of the very unique attributes of the photograph or photography in general. I mean, in any other medium, when we create something, we can build layers and work through it. And more often than not with other mediums, you can be very much in control. With photography, you always are at the risk of chance. There's always a hint of chance. And there's always something that existed there in that real space that is no longer there anymore. And so for me, this work, while it's not traditional, it's very much photography, but it's also something else. And I'm okay with sort of treading that space.
I'd go so far as to say that all photography is also ritual. I mean, there is the practice of looking through the lens, capturing a moment. Even if you're creating programs, it's selecting, it's curating. Simple question, but I was curious about this too. I was thinking about it when we were talking before we started, when you were explaining how you were first gathering gunpowder from shotgun shells. It reminded me of unwise things I did when I was young. Have you ever injured yourself or gotten a little bit nervous or out of control when you're working with these volatile materials?
Not seriously. I learned pretty quickly not to compress black powder into anything. I made a little mistake there, but it was pretty benign. It scared me. And otherwise, the only others, I've burned the hair off my legs a number of times because often I have to stand on top of the prints as I'm igniting them, but it's metal and other things, so it's relatively safe. The only strange thing I did was I did try to use a raptor, a hawk that I had found to make a print from. And when it didn't ignite, I kicked it and it exploded and flew up in there and landed on my back. But that was like the closest call I've had. Sorry, and I actually felt like I deserved it, so it's okay.
What was it that you had found?
It was like a hawk of some sort, a
That's what
raptor.
I thought you said. So you were you blew up a raptor, is what
I
the
was
story.
trying to, in essence, make a photogram, which I was envisioning as this great fiery, you know,
Phoenix.
phoenix of a bird, and it didn't really work.
Thank you for sharing that story. I appreciate why the ritual is and needs to be private as you are creating this work. It does sound like it would be really exciting to see. I just envision you like holding and lighting and stepping away, and this kind of it comes through in the work,
Yeah.
which I think is pretty incredible.
My
Uh,
children do love to watch. They'll come out and sort of sit in the background and watch as we make explosions. And it is a little bit of a spectacle. It's maybe disappointing in some ways because there's no big bangs. It's just a lot of smoke and a little bit of light.
right,
But
like your like the original noisemaker
Mhm.
was not quite
Yeah,
as your was it your father or your grandfather who did that?
my father, yeah, didn't quite meet the expectations, but it was something. It was
It's
good.
fascinating, the through line throughout all of your work. Uh, I want to thank you. We have a few more minutes. We can have a couple of them. Rick is mentioning that you have a video on Vimeo. We can share the link to that. Um,
Hmm.
Actually, when we publish this video, we can
Okay.
include that and anything else you'd like. As we
Sure. The Vimeo, it's a little misleading. My friend Jesse Reeser helped me put that together. I had my arm twisted into making a video, and he did a wonderful job, and it's great. But the images were made sort of in twilight, so in reality, they wouldn't work because, of course, everything would be exposed. But it gives you a sense of what's happening.
well, we can certainly share more when
Yeah.
we put this online. So I'm not seeing too many more questions come through. So I'm going to go ahead and thank you. We're getting close to 7:30 anyway. And Chris Colville, thank you so much for sharing your work, for telling such a compelling and interesting story. It's great to see that through line, and for being a supporter of camera work and photography here in the Bay Area for so long. It's great to connect with you. It's great to have you here at Camerawork again. And I hope we'll be able to do this again soon.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. It was really nice to be able to talk here with adults again. At this point in time, most of my conversations are with my kids, which I love, but it's, interesting to have a captive audience for a little while.
We are grateful to talk to you, and it's awesome for us to see artwork and talk to artists when that is so difficult to do. We can't be in the gallery, so we're grateful that we can be here. So thank you, Chris. I want to thank there's some board members in the house. I want to thank Erica Gentry and Michelle Branch and Phil Sager. Thank you, Erica, for bringing your class. What is it? Photo 81D students, thank you for being here. It seems like everybody is running off to class. Thank you for joining us. And we hope to see you back again at other events here at Camerawork. If you're not a member, visit our website. You can become a member. You can also donate to us. We rely on the support of the community in order to bring you programs like this. And speaking of programs, we have a couple really cool events coming up. Join us on Monday, October 26th. We'll have a talk with Bin Don. Speaking of process, he makes beautiful daguerreotypes. And I think that'll be another really great presentation, particularly on the heels of this work with Chris Colville. So join us for that on the 26th. And then most exciting, on the 29th, we will be kicking off our annual Forecast exhibition. Chris mentioned this in his talk. Forecast 2020, we will be kicking that off with an opening reception and an online exhibit on Thursday, October 29th. So please join us then. And until then, I will say goodnight. Thank you again, Chris. Thanks all of you for coming. And thanks as always to Christina Graver, who helps make all of this and everything we do at San Francisco Camera Work possible. Thank you, Christina. And with that, I'll say goodnight. Thank you all for joining us. We'll see you next time.